Hello, and welcome back to part two of the Modern Government Leaders Innovators Hours. Again, I am Cole von Glahn. I was with you yesterday, and I will be with you in the future. I am a consultant with the Partnership for Public Service, mostly working on federal technology and innovation for modern service delivery. The Partnership for Public Service for over 20 years has been a nonpartisan, nonprofit working towards a better government and a stronger democracy by supporting federal workforce development, public service leadership, and society's commitment to government. In partnership with Microsoft, we brought together the Modern Government Leaders Cohort, which is a group of expert executive innovators from across the federal government to share best practices, to collaborate on new modernization methods, and to deliver this series of fireside chats as a resource for others who are seeking to increase their impact through innovative methods, practices, and programs. And today, I'm joined by three members of this cohort who will share stories of how they put innovation into practice to deliver for our country and our people and our allies. But before we begin, I do just want to note that the views that they will express today are their own and not necessarily representative of the agencies with whom they work. That having been said, it's my pleasure to introduce three new panelists for Innovators Hour number 2. First off, we have Ishmael Alejo, the Director of Refundable Credits Program Management at the IRS. We have Jennifer Porter, Deputy Administrator of the Agricultural Marketing Service at USDA, and Max Pierce, the Director of Management and Administration at Naval Reactors within the Department of Energy. And just like all of them, y'all, I'd love to start off with what the problem was that you chose to address, what sort of issues you were looking at, and the story that you've decided to share with us today and those learnings. Could we start with you, please, Ishmael?
Sure, and good afternoon, everyone. And so the challenge that I faced in terms of actually the IRS faced as well was implementing the Advanced Child Tax Credit during the American Rescue Plan Act. If you recall, this was a piece of legislation that asked the IRS, which is a tax administration office, to deliver advance payments, calculate and deliver advance payments to individual taxpayers from July to December. We were able to do this in a span of 2 months since the legislation was signed in March, and we started payments in July by various transformation of our work process and what we in our various systems as well in terms of accelerating technology, looking at what we currently do, and partnering with other agencies, industry, and external stakeholders. Because of that effort, we were able to deliver during that time period in 2021, and hopefully folks in the audience receive some of those monthly payments, around $90 billion into the economy and delivered over 200 million payments and a wide variety of other services that we provided, whether it was an eligibility tool, allowing for a new authentication technology, or outreach within the communities itself. So I'll pass it back to you, Cole.
Thank you, Ish. And I'd like to send it down to Jennifer.
Hi, Cole, thanks. Yeah, so our agency in USDA, the Agricultural Marketing Service, many of the services we provide are not regulatory in nature, they're voluntary. They're aimed at facilitating the marketing of agricultural products. One of the ways we do that is by grading those products, and that name, that's exactly what it sounds like. We assign a grade to a product that aims to communicate to the end user whether it is good, better, best, right? So if you go to the grocery store and you look at a beef steak, you might see a label that says USDA choice. That's a way that the consumer can understand a little bit about the eating experience that they expect to receive. So it's really important, as you would imagine, that is a highly accurate and consistent service, but it's performed by people, right? So by its nature, it's somewhat subjective. We work hard and have for many years to reduce that subjectivity, right? We provide visual training aids. We do a lot of work to make sure that what is determined to be a grade A egg in Virginia is the same as a grade A egg in California. But at the end of the day, that is a human assessment. While it's worked really well for many years, the industries that we serve have changed, right? So think about poultry processing facilities, meat processing facilities, grain inspection facilities. They are moving at a faster pace than they ever have before. The products are more homogeneous than they were before. They're using data to drive decision making. And all of those things are influencing the way that we do our job. And most notably, there's also technology today that aims to do some of the things that we do with USDA employees, right? So there's vision-based technology that assigns a grade just as a person has done for many years. Our challenge in the agency has been trying to integrate that into the service that we provide to reduce that subjectivity and to do what we do more efficiently, more consistently. A unique thing that we have to wrestle with in our agency is that we don't generally work in USDA facilities. We don't generally own the equipment, right? So as we've tried to maximize the use of the technology, whether it be the grading systems, whether it be data generating systems about quality characteristics, we've had to do so in partnership with the facilities in which we work, right? Those are food producing companies, and with manufacturers. We've also found great partners through academia who are excited to do research that really helps us make that marketing system a little bit more efficient.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Max, can you round us out with the challenge you faced at Naval Reactors, please?
Absolutely. Thanks, Cole. So I think before I get into the challenge, I want to talk about just some context. Naval Reactors is unique in that we're a dual department organization. So within the Department of Defense, we're within the Navy, and within the Department of Energy, we're part of the National Nuclear Security Administration. That is by statute. We have certain authorities and responsibilities within each department and sub-agency. And it creates some unique technological challenges for us. About 600 of our folks in reactors are at our headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the other 300 are at our field offices around the world. At headquarters, we use primarily Navy unclassified computer systems, whereas at the field offices, we use primarily Department of Energy unclassified systems. So already you see an inconsistency with what our primary systems are based on just who owns the site. And so this has created a lot of challenges in my space, the human resources space, over the years. And historically, when we tried to fix those problems and create a unified solution, we either failed or it was clunky. And so the problem I want to talk about today is how that impacted one of the most basic functions of government employees, which is timekeeping. The problem was because of these systems that didn't communicate with each other, and one DOE HR system for DOE employees and a Navy HR system for our Navy employees, we were using paper timesheets, up until this year. So in 2024, paper or PDF, emailing at best, sometimes physically, dropping off and signing timesheets. We had folks that were manually entering time into agency systems. And the result was really just frustrated employees, frustrated HR professionals. And so when we were looking at, hey, what of these HR, IT challenges do we want to face first? We said, hey, let's start where you touch HR the most, which is timekeeping. And we wanted to work on that problem.
Wonderful. So those are our three problem spaces. And over the course of the last 8 months, you all have worked through sort of the ways you've addressed these over the course of several years at this point for some of these programs. And I'm curious, Jennifer, in your case, you've talked a little bit about this kind of incredibly large stakeholder map that you're working with. And when you have that wide of a space to work in, I'm curious how you even started addressing the question.
Yeah, I think the first step was really we knew that the technology existed, and we'd had some successes and failures in different commodity groups over the years. I think a real turning point for us was in taking our challenges a little more public, right? I think sometimes there's a hesitancy, maybe particularly in the government, to stand up and be very transparent about challenges, right? And so for some years we had toiled away with, there's technology in this space, but we don't have enough governance, or we don't have enough, partnership, or whatever the challenge was. And we sort of worked on that behind the scenes. But about 2 or 3 years ago, our agency decided that we were going to be just boldly transparent about, these are technologies that represent an opportunity to do what we do better for everybody, right? They represent more accurate service, better jobs for the employees. And so when we did that, when we took that kind of, outward step, we were met with a tremendous response, not just from the stakeholder industry that we interact most directly with, right? But, we have global stakeholders that, that care about our grading system. We had academia, we had all sorts of folks that kind of came out of the woodwork and said, we're really interested in your problem, and we're really interested in helping you solve it. So I think that was a bit of a turning point for us. And it made Cole what felt like, gee, how do we address all these different interests? It made that a little bit more achievable, just starting that conversation and doing so in a very transparent way.
I love that. We've talked a lot in Modern Government Leaders about sort of when the eye is on, how you respond to that, and how it can help drive some of your work, right? That being transparent can be a useful means to sort of add both a necessary feedback element and also that kind of pressure to push you forward. And Ish, I'm curious, your program was pretty visible during COVID-19, and it was a very important part of the rescue plan. And so in the same vein, how did you address this challenge under that kind of scrutiny?
Yeah, so it was, as you mentioned, it definitely had a lot of eyes on it in terms of delivery for IRS. Fortunately, a couple things. One, we had leadership in Treasury and IRS who really entrusted and gave ownership to not only myself, but my partners in IT and other organizations, where we were able to work across the agency and even in with Treasury to frame up important decisions quickly, with regards to how do we implement something? How do you we want to change this authentication system. We want to reach out to these specific cities. So I think that piece, and we've talked about it in our convenings about the top cover, really came from the high level leadership of both Treasury and IRS. And then second, I think sometimes the pressure of a short runway and high visibility can cause the natural collaboration needed, because it was really a situation where we couldn't fail because we had to deliver for the public, right? And fortunately, we had trial runs and lessons learned from past experiences, like the economic impact payments that were first started that even had shorter runways. This new piece with the advanced child tax credit was novel from those other efforts, in the sense that this was now a monthly payment over the span of 6 months. And when you think of IRS, you usually interact with us generally once a year when you file your return, and then we issue your refund. You don't normally think, hey, IRS is going to deposit money into my bank account or mail me a check. And so that was also another aspect of it, with regards to, even because of its visibility, we also needed to ensure that we inform the public of what it is that we were delivering. Because you had the law, you had folks talking about it, but the details are always what folks are interested in.
Yeah, and I can definitely say, as someone who was maneuvering that question at the time on the other end, knowing those specifics was really important to me to really understand, like, oh, good, that amount of money is what is supposed to have just shown up in my bank account, and I'm not going to be liable for anything. Love that. So I appreciate that detail-driven approach. Max, on your end, there's this real sense of sort of partnership and unification, and we've heard both Jennifer and Ish talk about how you sort of bring stakeholders together. And that was really the crux, the piece of delivery that you were trying to do. Can you talk about, from the sort of internal side of things, crossing that silo in federal government, and how you went about doing that?
Sure, absolutely. You know, I think it started with leadership recognition that, hey, our support organizations, need to be prioritized just as we prioritize our technical work. And so that was really important in terms of, putting the infrastructure in place, putting the resources in place in general. But then it takes vision, right? And the unique vision our IT organization had was, hey, because of our unique dual department structure, we need our own internal application development group. And so, as opposed to contracting out some of this development work, we actually have a federal team that does this work. And the key thing about that is they understand our challenges, right? They know what people need. They understand, the unique natures of our different sites, our different systems, and that's super rare in government, right? You often see this contracted out, and often people spend large dollar amounts on, IT fixes that don't work. And so I think this is really a success story of, again, building an infrastructure, the IT team approaching it as an internal federal challenge to go work these issues at a huge cost savings, I might add. And then for our unique problem, it was, hey, what's the end state, right? And we needed to get all stakeholders involved. I'm going to repeat that a bunch, because it wasn't until we got the HR stakeholders and the IT stakeholders and employees' perspectives all incorporated that we came up with a solution that served everyone, right? Version 1.0, which I'll talk about, really served employees, but it didn't serve my team, right? And so the true success only came when we got all three of those stakeholders' views represented.
That's interesting. Yeah, how that sense of each individual stakeholder needing to have a voice that is heard and acknowledged, so that they understand where they've been heard. And we've talked a lot about sort of how even that in and of itself can be a major challenge just to accomplish within the sort of scope of an innovative program. But I'm curious if any of you have a particular example of, like, a major challenge or hurdle that you faced while trying to move this forward.
Well, I can take that first. One of the other things that we really struggled with internally was, naturally, sometimes increasing the use of technology decreases, perhaps, or at least comes with the perception, right, that there is an offsetting decrease in a person's contribution to the process, right? So in the work that we do, quite clearly, using more technology means either fewer people or a different job, right? We've struggled with that for a while, but we were also dealing with some pretty significant recruitment and retention issues. The folks that do this type of work in our agency, they work in packing plants, they work on grain barges, they work in food production facilities. Quite frankly, sometimes, these environments may not always be very pleasant. Sometimes they come with safety, challenges and considerations. And so recruitment and retention has been an issue. And it wasn't until we started really talking very openly to the workforce about, don't look at the inclusion of technology as a way to threaten your position. Think of it as a way to not only improve the day-to-day work, right? Maybe your job morphs a little bit. Maybe you don't have to do, continuous oversight. You move more to an audit posture and you check what a facility is doing instead of being more kind of quality control. but it also allows you to maybe get out of some of those environments all the time. That has been something that and just the use of technology, right? Max talked a little bit about, the idea that in 2023 or 2024, somebody's going to walk into the federal government and fill out a timesheet, right? That doesn't generally excite folks that are thinking about a career in the federal government. Similarly, that's something that we've really talked openly about and people have been excited about, is just bringing new elements to the work that bring some complexity and maximize technologies that I think people expect now and don't maybe have to adjust to and deal with the same way they previously did.
To piggyback off of some themes that Jennifer mentioned, first, it's the piece about communication internally with the workforce and being transparent about the change that is coming also is applicable when you're dealing, because our programs in the federal government also deal with the public, right? So during that period of the when we were making the monthly payments, we had such a short delivery timeline that, of course, there were some programming issues that we had to fix. There were we put out public statements informing the taxpayers about, here's where you can get more information. Here's a tool to help you determine if you're eligible. And in particular, tying into another theme that Jennifer talked about is the use of technology. We recognize as an agency we had, and you heard me mention a couple times now, this authentication system that really was not as accessible as it should be for the public to clear. So we accelerated a method whereby instead of 30% of taxpayers being able to authenticate, it went up as high as 60 to 70%. And that was important because that technology allowed folks to access the areas and the tools that we were informing them about, such as, hey, if you changed your address during the year, here's a place where you can tell us about it. Because recall, right, that generally the interaction with the IRS is just once a year when you file your return. So that was an important piece that kind of ties in, whether it's internal facing or external facing, to any challenge.
Yeah, Ish, and just going on from that, I mean, I think, resources underline all of our projects, right? And so, a big challenge for us wasn't necessarily the availability of resources, it was the prioritization. So, the first version of our kind of new timekeeping system provided a common platform for our employees, right? But the problem is it basically just spit out a batch file on the back end that we still had to manually enter into two people, full-time job virtually, manually entering that information into agency systems so it could actually be affected into people's pay. Hugely inefficient, right? So from an employee standpoint, worked great. From the HR standpoint, we were still challenges, and that wasn't the application development team's fault. We on the HR side didn't have the resources to prioritize getting the requirements right. So once we did, right, we were able to come up with a solution that served everybody, right? And I think that it takes a lot of discipline, especially when you're going through an HR transformation, IT transformation like we are right now, to stay focused on projects through completion, right? And I think what's reinforced to me is just the rigor that's needed, not just up front, but to stay focused on, start one, finish one, as opposed to trying to do a bunch of projects at once, letting them languish or not getting the full output out of the project you were looking for.
And so that brings us to this idea of programs to completion, right? I think that's a really interesting question in this space because modernization kind of never ends, right? And if we ever get to the end point of innovation, we've actually failed as innovators. But all that being said, I'm curious at this stage, what impacts you all have started to see from your work? And if you have a few, who might have been some critical contributors who helped you get there? You've talked a lot about, people matter, stakeholderism matters, bringing in these coalitions and this buy-in really, really matters. And so I'm curious if there are particular folks or teams that have been really important to how you've delivered this work. And I see, Ish, it looks like you have a thought on this.
Yeah, so first, in terms of impact, what you start seeing, and as I mentioned earlier, we talked about how the economic impact payments started, then it evolved to these monthly payments with the advanced child tax credit. And because of the delivery of IRS, you start seeing legislation that says, okay, for the clean energy, for example, there's aspects of it that are where the credit can be issued to the manufacturer. In the near future, there's the savers match where individuals and IRS is asked to issue matching credits to retirement accounts. All of these are efforts are building on from those past efforts, right? Because this is also transforming how the IRS conducts tax administration and frankly, how the IRS is viewed. And beyond just administration, but now as a benefits delivery agency as well. And I think the important aspect of all of those changes and that we built upon has been because of the support of our leadership. In particular, there were one of our commissioners, his name is Ken Corbin. He really entrusted me and my team, along with me working with our counterparts in IT, to execute and frame things quickly. And I really appreciated that support because I didn't feel like I had to, in that kind of space and timeline, you don't have time to question like, is this something that you need to do? There needs to be decisions that need to be made, negotiations with other functions and other agencies that really require trust from senior leadership. So I think that was the one example, and he's one leader in the IRS that really helped move that effort forward.
Wonderful. And Max, I saw that you had a thought about this intersection of contributor and impact.
Yeah, thanks, Cole. I love that Ish talked about the intangible benefits. I think it is appropriate to talk about the tangible benefits, dollars, and I'll talk about those. But the intangible benefits are huge for us. Like Ish, delivering a system like this is a big credibility and trust boost for our employees, in the HR and IT organizations. And I really think it's a building block for future projects. When we were trying to figure out where to start, again, it was where people interact the most with HR. So you can have a reinforced feeling, every 2 weeks when you're submitting time, hey, that was so much easier, right? And you start to build some momentum. But tangibly, we were able to save several work years just from the inefficiency of manual data entry and moving these, paper PDFs around. There's better accuracy and more focus on internal controls and an increase in morale for the entire workforce, and in particular for the folks directly involved in this process from an administration perspective. And it really took a lot of folks to make that vision happen. From senior leadership, it was resources. For me and IT leadership, it's the vision of hey, we can do this. For HR and IT stakeholders, it was getting the requirements right. And I'd say employees too. And then for the application development team, bringing that vision to reality. So it's never one person. I talk about the value of the team so much. In this case, not only did it take the whole team coming together to make it happen, but I think the whole team's going to get a lot of benefit tangibly and intangibly from the success.
Yeah, the customer impact piece has been something that has come up in a lot of our breakfast conversations over the last 8 months. And Jennifer, I'm curious, you have, as I said a little bit ago, right, this very wide sort of stakeholder map, a lot of different customers and different types of customers. And I'm curious where the impacts of your work have been felt by them.
Yeah, I think, I mentioned that our agency is mostly driven by user fee services, right? So said another way, if what we do isn't of value to the agricultural industry, well, then we don't do that anymore. And so that creates a little bit of a different customer dynamic, maybe certainly different for government. But when we think about the challenges with delivering this grading service in a way that met their needs, nothing replaced that, one-to-one feedback, if you will, right? Sitting across the table from our stakeholders and hearing quite directly what they needed from our grading program, that helped us really set the course for how we were going to go about making these improvements, and Max talks a lot about kind of bringing multiple people to the table towards success. We did the same thing, right? We had both, the stakeholder side and our side from senior leaders at USDA, all the way throughout the organization, folks around the table talking really honestly about why is this improvement important, right? Why is it so important that we refine an already pretty good process, right? And then you hear very directly in terms of dollars and cents, and this is how I make decisions on my farm, ranch, or feedlot. You hear very directly, about the impact of your work. And so I just, maybe I'd like to think that's something that our agency, and particularly, all of USDA does really well. We meet our stakeholders where they are. We walk through their feedlot with them, right? We, kind of go out in a field, and I hope that brings some credibility to our work, and it helps our folks understand that real impact.
Wonderful. And I do love that sense of, kind of the walk a mile in their shoes idea that you're proposing there, right? And I think that that's how a lot of us learn anything, is by really trying to experience it and take those learnings and experiences forward. And so I'm curious, after, having worked through some of the processes that the three of you have worked through, what some of your biggest lessons learned, or lessons that you feel others might be able to take from your experience doing these things. Max, I noticed that you had sent me something in our chat about this, and I wonder if you could share that with the audience here.
Yeah, thanks, Cole. I'd love to start. So I think, a common theme is taking and doing something with the feedback from your stakeholders. And while we absolutely wanted to do that, I think the tendency often is to go for the biggest, grandest project. And I think what we recognized was we really need to start where there's the greatest friction, and for us, there's a frequency of this process that was creating a ton of friction, right? And so it might have not had the biggest impact on changing the organization or advancing us forward. But if we resolve that friction, again, then we build trust. That's going to help us with future buy-in on future projects, future resourcing, right? And the belief, starts to build, and transforming ourselves into, the world-class organization we want to be. But also in project execution, I've said it a couple of times, but just a huge lesson on effective partnering with all stakeholders. If you get buy-in from half your stakeholders, you might have a product that serves half. And so it wasn't until we brought everybody to the table that we were able to come up with the best solution. So really reinforces what we've all talked about, the importance of stakeholder feedback upfront, so you can make the best informed decisions on your project selection and ultimately project execution.
Wonderful. And looking back at the tax credits from the COVID times-ish, what do you have for us today on lessons that you've pulled from that into your work now?
Something to piggyback off of what Max said is really about the stakeholders and partnerships, both internally and externally. So as an example, internally, my partners in IT and other functions were folks who I um, uh, were parts of cohort for our leadership program, and years before this started. And that provided that ability to really have those candid conversations late at night when you're trying to figure out how do we solve this problem, because of that relationship that was built, right? So for me, the lesson learned is it is super important that you build those relationships before something is needed or before something is happens. Externally, uh, it really highlighted how to align and um, look at the missions of the different agencies or organizations and how to create messaging or um, take feedback and improve and adjust while you're still in flight and delivering, right? So, for example, we work closely with the Bureau of Fiscal Service because they are our integral partners in the delivery of the child tax credit advance payments. So. Uh, that required a lot of communication as well. You've heard from all of us about that piece uh, with the constant communication. But really, for me, that the lessons learned were the partnerships and the collaborations, and really establishing that early on before that problem or issue or project um, is in front of you.
Wonderful. And Jennifer, do you have any thoughts on this sort of lessons learned, lessons to broadcast question?
Yeah, but first, I mean, I want to double down on what Ish said. I think having those relationships before, frankly, you need them is critical. Folks aren't going to be willing to pull up to the table and help solve a problem with you if that's the first time you've met, right? So I can't underscore that enough. I think for me, and I've talked a little bit about it, the biggest lesson for us has been I wish we had talked a little bit more sooner about the vision, right? We were, worried that we didn't have all the answers. And so, and probably a little hesitant to talk to the stakeholder community about that. We were worried about the potential impact on the workforce. And so, right, kind of shied away from that. But I found the opposite when we started talking about, our vision is that we can use these technologies to improve service, and we think it looks like this. We're not quite sure how fill in the gap. People responded, and right, they responded positively and in spades. And so if there's one thing, I would suggest folks do is kind of own that vision a little bit sooner, and you don't have to have all the answers before you really start talking to others openly about those possibilities.
Max, you just sent me a note that you have a thought about Jennifer's comments here and maybe how they connect to some broader themes around innovation. Would you mind sharing those out?
Sure. I think a key to any success is sustaining that success, right? And I think, Jennifer talks about the key of upfront stakeholder, engagement, really having that early. But, the why of that for our project was don't assume others are going to see the value, right? And I think it's a little easier on a project like I mentioned, but there's plenty where, certainly HR stakeholders really see the impact, but others might not, right? So you can't make assumptions, and the upfront stakeholder alignment and engagement will help you either help them understand or take in some other information that might reroute you to a different priority. I also think it's just hugely important, in terms of sustaining that momentum, to continue championing the project wins, whether they're big or small, even during sustainment. It's really easy, when you're months, years out from something, to stop talking about it, right? But you've got to continue relooking at it, making sure that it continues to serve, your employees or your stakeholders. But keep talking about why that's a good solution, if it still is. So I think it's really easy in government, especially, my background on the DoD side. People tend to be humble, right? They don't want to champion the successes. Just hugely important, especially in sustainment.
Interesting. Yeah, we've talked a lot about sort of what it takes to keep these things going after maybe you've been moved to another project or your attention has been forced to shift. And a lot of what you all have shared in our convenings is like, you have to make sure that other people are bought in at the level you are. And one way to do that is to make sure that people are hearing why this is working, which also seems, we've also heard a lot from y'all about like, there are moments when you have an issue and you look back and you go, oh, great, this is something that someone decided in like 1995 and we've never talked about it since. And if you keep things in the light, then an idea that is good but starts to sort of lose some of its benefit just by virtue of the changing context can be addressed more quickly. And so in this context of sort of how you sustain an innovation, Ish, I'm wondering if you have anything to offer the audience on what it takes to make sure that something stays strong over time.
To build off of some of the comments that Max mentioned, you first you have to relook and be okay with the fact that, okay, when we rolled this out during this effort, we would have done this differently, right? As an example, we had a exhaustive list of like what we would have done differently after all the monthly payments were made. And and I will say, like, those lessons are things that I've shared with my colleagues um, throughout who are now working different efforts and leading different efforts, right? Because although it may not be directly relevant, it is something that they're going to build on top of and make it better. So I think the really looking and being comfortable with yeah, that didn't work the time that we rolled it out, but it will work better this next round for this particular type of project. I think is important because just that ensures, and to your comment about looking at programs and constantly, and Max's comment on re-looking at them, that's what you have to do to keep those programs going, right? And have them transform and adjust to what is needed for the time that you are executing on them.
Hmm. Jennifer, I saw you sort of pop up there. What are you thinking about here?
Yeah, this sounds pretty basic, but I think it's really important to make sure that especially new or new programs, initiatives, things of that nature are properly resourced. I think my agency, right, we have a little bit of a habit of other duties as assigned, right? And so we want to kick off a new thing, right? We want to make a process improvement. We want to do whatever, and it's added to somebody's existing plate, right? And so we've worked kind of against that tendency, right? Everybody wants to be good stewards of tax, whether it's taxpayer dollar, whether it's a dollar that we get from a customer on a voluntary program, right? And so I think that drives us to be try to be as resourceful as possible. But lots of times what takes continuous improvement and innovative thought is having time and space to think about that in your day, and having somebody that's dedicated to the success of that program or project.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've talked a lot in the convenings. You all have brought up this idea of the sort of trauma of trying, right? That folks who have been given mandates previously to innovate, to modernize, to do something new, have done it many times and maybe seen it not be taken in the directions that they had hoped for, that they had been told to expect, and how that can make it harder then to inspire those folks to take up that mantle one more time and take it up one more time, right? And so I'm curious about this kind of resourcing question. When you are first looking at, okay, I'm going to try something new today, we're going to start a new program. How do you first assess that problem space? What are the things that you initially try to think about and kind of get down on paper and solve before you start taking people's time and energy and using the trust that you've built up? I'm curious if any of the three of you have a thought about where your best foot first starts.
So, Cole, for me, the approach with regard around that question is figuring out what is like putting myself in the shoes of the end receiver of that project. So in the case in the case of the advanced child tax credit, I was looking always in the lens of how will the taxpayer, what do they need in terms of information, in terms of receiving the funds, that then help drive the planning and the coordination across the agency and across with different other agencies as well. So I think that piece was critical, because if you lose sight of why you're doing what you're doing, I think that you end up just creating something that really wasn't something that the recipient wanted, right? So I think for me, that was step one. And in terms of the resourcing aspect, I think because of the past successes in delivering the economic impact payment, we were fortunate enough that as they continue, as it continues to be where IRS is asked to deliver credits in advance or in other methods, they are recognized. It is being recognized that that requires resources, right? And so I think delivery and execution in prior efforts will build upon and hopefully get recognition and resources for future efforts, similar efforts.
Jennifer, do you have a thought about sort of when you were looking at this program? And I know you've talked about wanting to provide that vision earlier for folks, but was there a sort of resource or personnel space that helped you understand, okay, here's, at least for yourself, here's the vision I have and how I'm going to define it and prepare to present it to folks?
Well, I mean, actually, what Ish said about being really laser focused on what is the problem you are trying to solve and who are you trying to help? Those are the things that I think, when you think about how do you start, right? You have this idea about making things better. You better be really clear about who it is that you're trying to help and that there are some shared objectives there, because it can be pretty easy to lose sight of, that sort of, I keep using the term stakeholder. That's clearly something that drives our mission here, but making sure that you're staying true to solving a problem for whoever it is that you're charged to solve that problem for, and that you're doing so in a way that's keeping with the mission. We think a little bit here at our agency about, our job is to facilitate marketing of agricultural products. That doesn't look today like it did 20 years ago, and it doesn't look today like it will look 20 years from now. And so our job is not, to sort of preserve ourselves, if you will. Our job is to be flexible enough. And luckily we have leadership support and the right, statutory authority to do that. Our job is to be flexible enough that we can continue to serve in that role and carry out our mission, no matter what that looks like, even if it looks different, right?
For sure. And so then I'm curious, when it comes to sort of learning from others, right? And how you all as executives, top of your game, how you bring in what other people have to offer in designing a program or implementing the processes. We've had an opportunity to talk for a while now in modern government leaders and sort of share best practices with each other. And I'm curious if there's something from those conversations that either impacted this particular program that you were working on or has impacted your thinking about innovation moving forward, something that you think is a helpful driver for folks who want to make this kind of change at the higher levels of the civil service. And this question is to any of you. I don't have a specific person to sort of launch it off here. So if something stands out, feel free to jump in.
Nicole, I'll jump in there. I think people often jump to the solution, and there's not enough discussion, especially with junior folks like the subject matter experts or individual contributors that really know a process inside and out before people start deriving solutions. And so, the point is ask questions, don't make assumptions. And I think when we do that, we come up with, again, solutions that better serve everybody, right? Instead of just a smaller segment of the population. And then there's, data. How much time are you wasting on a process, or could you save, right? The rigor up front when you're looking at a problem, not just to look at it, qualitatively, but quantitatively, and to figure out what your measurables are. It's going to help you figure out whether you're on track, off track, and frankly, whether you get, down to a version 1.0 and decide, hey, this just isn't worth it. And so, Ish talked a lot about, iterating and looking at things maybe you haven't looked at it in a long time. Even a project you've been working on for a few months, you may look at it and say, hey, we're not going to be able to achieve the glide slope we thought. We've got to abandon this and go a different path. I think that's super important. If you don't know your objective when you start, you won't know when to pivot or to abandon.
Yeah, I thought about something Max said earlier about articulating your vision and doing it over and over again, right? I mean, I think anybody who's thinking about taking on a big change needs to be prepared to get tired of hearing themselves talk about it, right? I mean, you've got to talk about it over and over again at all levels of the organization, to all of your stakeholders, to yourself, right? It's a marathon, not a sprint, right? So trying to find some balance between setting aggressive yet reasonable deadlines that folks can, latch on to, because in most cases, especially the bigger things that we have to deal with, they're not quick. And I think making it such that people can see progress as you're on that journey is really important, because as time, as the months fly by on the calendar, it's easy to lose sight. So that perseverance is important, and just continuing to reiterate that message to everybody along, that you encounter along the way, really important.
And I just want to build on two things. One, Max said about asking questions. I found that that is a fundamental piece when you're trying to look at how to transform or innovate, is don't be afraid to ask those questions. I think it's legitimate to say, is this something, why have we been doing this way? Is there a way to do this differently? And sometimes the answer could be, yeah, it's the current process that's working. And that just validates what you're doing. And then the second piece that Jennifer talked about that I thought was also important was around the ability to really communicate and be a storyteller. The good leaders that I've seen when you're trying to drive change can tell a story to describe it in a story that anyone can understand. Because I think in any organization, whether it's the federal government or in the private sector, the more that you have to describe about what it is that's happening in the change, there are varying levels of what's in it for that individual, the level of understanding, and the level of impact. And I think the more you can create a story about it, or say it as describe it as something that's interesting, I think the more you can get folks to remember, and it will stick with those individuals.
Ish, you're speaking my language. As you know, for the time we've spent together, I have a very soft spot in my heart for the power of storytelling. And so we just have about 5 minutes left here, and I'd love to build off of that for a moment, and just ask you all to provide an idea or a thought or a response to this question of storytelling and the importance of communicating to folks exactly what it is you're trying to do. And if you have a piece of advice for people listening about how you have seen maybe what your best method for building buy-in was over the course of building out these programs, was there a particular moment or method that you used that really helped you connect with someone and bring them into your coalition? Again, open question. Please feel free, anyone who has a thought. I know I kind of sprung this one on you.
I think, what I've realized, especially recently, we were rolling out, an updated human capital plan for our organization. And I think the tendency often is to focus on the what, right? Hey, here's the plan. Here are the things that go with that. It's fairly easy to make a story about that, right? Hey, here we're going to do these things. We think it's going to yield us X, Y, or Z. You can present those in terms people can understand. But there's also the how, right? And I think, organizationally, we often lose sight of the fact that how people go about doing something has just as big of an effect on the outcome as knowing whatever your destination is. And so what I've talked to both, peers, leaders, and my own team about is how, right? How are our cultural norms? How, in terms of how, we work with each other, support each other, contribute to one another on our projects or others. How is all of that going to contribute to us actually, doing effective innovation? And so I think that's a big learning for me. I'm trying to apply that in my organization heavily right now. Again, don't just focus on the whatever the project is. How are we going to go about doing that? How are we going to interact with each other? And how are our behaviors going to support getting to that end?
I love that focus on the how. Jennifer, do you have an additional thought on this question?
Yeah, I would just say what's been particularly eye-opening is really you needing to understand what everybody's interest is in whatever it is that you're trying to do, right? Everybody's motivators are not the same. How you're going to address concerns that a person has about whatever that change motion is, it's going to be very different. And so I think Ish talked a little bit about that too, really understanding everybody's different needs and interests and catering the way that you tell that story to them so it's most impactful has been meaningful for us.
Wonderful. I want to thank all three of you for all of your work throughout Modern Government Leaders, throughout this conversation, and obviously, and most importantly, in your careers and your work in the civil service. I know from the 8 months we've spent together, the impact you're having and the dedication you show. And I'm just so pleased that you could join us for this Innovators Hour. Thank you both. Thank you all so much. To our audience at home, we have 2 more of these left. They'll be in mid-September before we host the entire thing on the partnership's YouTube page. But I want to thank you all for coming and learning a little bit more about how innovation and modernization are driving the federal government forward. Once again, my name is Cole. I'm from the Partnership for Public Service, and thank you all for joining us today. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.